Neca was the heart of her village, known not just for her radiant beauty but for her kind and selfless spirit. She helped the elders, played with the children, and was the first to offer her assistance to anyone in need. There was a warmth in her that could light up even the darkest corners of the village, making everyone feel like they were home. From the elders who relied on her for comfort to the children who played with her for hours, Neca's influence spread far and wide. But with such beauty and kindness, there was one person who could not bear the light that Neca cast on the world. Ngozi, Neca's closest friend, shared her heart and dreams for many years. At first, their bond was inseparable, two women bound by mutual love and respect, sharing secrets and laughter as only the closest of friends do. However, as time passed, envy began to creep into Ngozi's heart, though she concealed it well. Ngozi admired Neca, yes, but with admiration came an insidious feeling. She envied Neca's beauty and the effortless way she commanded the affection of everyone around her. For the first time in her life, Ngozi felt that she was not the center of attention. Her own talents and beauty, though undeniable, were overshadowed by Neca's brilliance. Instead of being supportive, Ngozi grew resentful. Every compliment Neca received felt like an insult to her own self-worth. As the years wore on, these feelings of jealousy festered, and a plan was born in Ngozi's heart. A plan that would rid her of the woman who, in her mind, had taken everything she desired. The day came when Ngozi invited Neca over, offering a special drink she had prepared. The drink was meant to be a gesture of kindness, a way to celebrate their long friendship, or so Neca thought. But there was poison hidden in the sweet-smelling concoction, a poison that would take Neca's life swiftly and silently. Ngozi watched with cold eyes as her friend sipped the drink, a smile on her face as she praised the flavors. As Neca drank, Ngozi's heart beat faster, not from excitement but from a deep, dark anticipation. She knew what was coming. Soon after, Neca began to feel weak. She excused herself to rest, attributing it to exhaustion, but within hours, her breathing became labored, her body convulsing in pain. She fell into an eternal slumber, and with her death, the village lost its brightest star. Ngozi, however, saw it as a victory. The woman she envied was gone, and now no one could stand in her way. But she had underestimated the depth of the love the village had for Neca, and she had underestimated the truth that would come in the wake of Neca's untimely death. In the dead of night, under the cover of darkness, Ngozi and a few conspirators, others who had been silently complicit in her plans, rushed to bury Neca's body. They knew that if they waited until daylight, suspicion would fall upon them. The villagers would question why Neca was not seen at dawn, why she had not stirred from her home, and they would eventually discover the truth. So they acted quickly, taking her body far from the village, to a small, secluded plot of land in the forest. The earth swallowed her whole as the conspirators dug her grave, and with each shovelful of dirt, they believed they were erasing Neca's existence entirely. They believed that no one would ever know the truth. They had hidden their crime under the veil of night, and in their hearts, they were certain they had silenced her forever. But they did not understand the power of Neca's spirit, nor did they understand the depths of her connection to the earth and the spirits that watched over the land. Though her body had been buried in the dark, her soul was far from gone. Neca's death had not been the end. No, it had only been the beginning. The earth, the skies, and the shadows held secrets beyond what the conspirators could comprehend. In time, those secrets would unravel, and Neca's shadow would return, knocking at their door before the sun even had the chance to rise. What the conspirators did not realize was that death was not the end of Neca's story. Her spirit was stronger than any poison, and the force of her connection to her village and the forces beyond it would not be denied. Though they buried her body in the dead of night, her shadow would rise again, and the reckoning for the betrayal would begin. The village of Nkambi had always been a peaceful place, where every face was familiar, and every hand knew the other's name. But Neca's death had cast a deep shadow over the community, one that seemed to stretch further than the mournful grief they all felt. In the days following her passing, the villagers gathered to remember her kindness, her beauty, and her unwavering generosity. They wept for the loss of a bright spirit that had once illuminated their lives. Yet there was something amiss in the air, something that none could quite put into words. It was as if the village itself had forgotten how to breathe. Though the villagers grieved, a collective unease lingered in their hearts. The silence was heavy, unsettling. The mourning was palpable, but there was an undercurrent of something more, a feeling that the air around them was charged with an invisible tension. They couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong, something was not quite right, but they couldn't put a name to it. The elders spoke of this feeling in hushed tones, recalling tales of ancestral spirits that sometimes lingered after untimely deaths, seeking justice or revenge for unresolved wrongs. But even they could not explain what they felt now. It was on the night of Neca's burial that the first sign of something unnatural began to surface. The evening had fallen dark and cold, the moon hanging high in the sky. The villagers, having seen Neca's body laid to rest in the distant forest, returned to their homes, their hearts heavy with grief and their minds clouded with guilt. But something stirred in the night air, an unsettling wind began to howl. It was not the usual evening breeze that rustled through the trees. This wind was different. It had a sharpness to it, a voice in its howls that seemed to carry with it a warning. As the wind picked up, the animals in the village began to act strangely. The chickens cackled erratically, the dogs barked without reason, and the cattle huddled together in fear, their eyes wide with terror. The cats, usually aloof and independent, arched their backs and hissed at invisible forces, their tails flicking nervously as if they could sense something no one else could see. It was as if the very creatures of the village were disturbed, sensing something that the villagers could not. Even the trees seemed to whisper in the wind, their leaves rustling with a strange urgency. By the time the villagers retired to their homes, many of them couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They lay awake, staring at the darkened ceilings of their huts, their hearts racing with an inexplicable dread. The very air around them seemed thick with a presence, a weight that made breathing difficult. It wasn't the sadness of Neca's death alone, it was something more primal, more ancient, a stirring of spirits long forgotten. And though they couldn't articulate it, they knew that something had been disturbed. The peace of the village had been broken, and they could feel it in their bones. Before dawn, as the village remained cloaked in silence, something strange happened at Ngozi's house. She had lain in her bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. Her mind raced with guilt over her betrayal, and yet, deep down she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Neca was gone, she had won. But despite the cold satisfaction that crept into her heart, there was still something unsettling about the events of the night. It was almost as if the very darkness of the world had grown thicker, as though the night itself was holding its breath, waiting. Ngozi was the first to notice it. It was the faintest movement, the smallest shift, but it was enough to make her pulse quicken. There, in the early morning light, a shadow appeared at her doorstep. It wasn't the kind of shadow one would expect to see at such an hour. This one was far too sharp, too defined. It stretched across the dirt floor in a way that made Ngozi's blood run cold. She squinted, straining her eyes, but there was no one there. The shadow didn't belong to any living creature, and yet it moved. Slowly, it crept along the ground as if it had a life of its own. It seemed to sway gently with the wind that was still stirring outside, casting long eerie fingers that reached for the walls of her hut. Ngozi froze in terror. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but her throat felt tight as if the very air had been sucked from her lungs. She wanted to turn away, to hide, but she couldn't take her eyes off the shadow that seemed to reach for her. The shadow moved closer, but it did not enter her home. It hovered at the doorway, and for a long moment, it seemed to pause as if it were waiting for something. Ngozi, trembling, pulled the blankets tighter around her, praying that the vision would disappear, that the shadow would fade with the dawn. But it didn't. As dawn's first light touched the earth, the shadow lingered at the door, then slowly dissipated, melting away like mist in the morning sun. The terror that gripped Ngozi's heart did not lift, and in the hours that followed, she couldn't shake the haunting feeling that she had just experienced something far beyond her understanding. It was as if Neca's very spirit had returned, not in the way the villagers might have expected, with an ethereal presence or a voice calling out from beyond the grave, but through a shadow, a force that seemed to bend the very rules of the world. Ngozi, in her state of shock, could not bring herself to speak of what she had seen. She feared that no one would believe her, that they would dismiss her claims as the result of a troubled mind. Yet as the day wore on, the unease in the village deepened. Word began to spread of strange happenings throughout Nkambi. The villagers, though grieving, could not ignore the growing sense of dread that hung over them like a thick fog. They began to notice things they hadn't before: shadows moving where they shouldn't, flickers of light in the corners of their eyes, and strange noises in the stillness of the night. It became clear that something, or someone, was watching them, waiting. And the villagers, once united in their grief for Neca, now found themselves divided by fear. The suspicion that had always been latent in their hearts began to surface. Whispers began to spread through the village, rumors of ghosts and spirits returning to seek justice. But what truly terrified them was the thought that Neca's death had not been the end. No, it was only the beginning. They realized that her shadow had returned, and with it, the judgment of the dead. The villagers could only wait in fear, uncertain of when or how Neca's spirit would reveal itself next. Everywhere they looked, they saw the shadow of Neca lurking just out of sight, a reminder of the dark betrayal that had taken her life. And as the days passed, the feeling that something dark and vengeful was stirring in the village grew stronger. The villagers could no longer ignore it. They had buried Neca, but they had failed to bury the truth, and that truth, like the shadow that haunted their every step, was about to come knocking at their door. In the stillness of the night, when the village of Nkambi was wrapped in darkness and only the faintest whispers of wind passed through the trees, Neca's shadow began to return. It was always in the dead of night that the shadow appeared, faint at first, a flicker in the moonlight, but unmistakable. The villagers had grown used to the uneasy feeling that followed her death, but now, as the days turned into weeks, they could no longer ignore the strange occurrences that seemed to haunt their nights. It started small, just a shadow flickering by a window, a fleeting shape caught out of the corner of an eye. But then it grew more persistent. It wasn't long before the villagers found themselves afraid of the dark. No one could explain what was happening, and no one wanted to acknowledge the truth. Each night, it would visit someone else's home. It never stayed for long, never uttered a word, but the impact was undeniable. When the door opened to reveal only the faintest shadow, a chill would rush through the person who dared to face it. Heartbeats would race and breath would catch. Those who had encountered it spoke of a weight pressing down on their chest, as if the air itself was thicker, more oppressive. But no one could explain it. No one could make sense of the shadow's visitations. It came, it knocked, and it left, leaving only the sense of dread in its wake. But the one person who could not ignore the shadow was Ngozi. The guilt that had begun to creep into her heart after Neca's death was now consuming her entirely. The shadow had begun to haunt her in ways that no one else seemed to understand. It would appear outside her window in the dead of night, a dark shape moving in the corner of her eye. At first, she convinced herself that it was her imagination, her conscience playing tricks on her. But soon she could no longer deny the truth. Neca's spirit had returned, and it was demanding something. Ngozi had tried to move on, to live her life as though nothing had changed, but it was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Neca's face, smiling and beautiful, before it morphed into something colder, something accusatory. It was as if the shadow had become a constant reminder of her betrayal, and the deeper the guilt sank into her, the more vivid the shadow grew. She could no longer go to sleep without feeling the prickling sensation that someone was watching her. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustling of the wind made her jump. She was no longer safe in her own skin. Every shadow seemed to be Neca's. Every movement felt like it was being observed, analyzed. At first, Ngozi tried to ignore it, but the guilt gnawed at her until it felt like there was no escape. The shadow had followed her everywhere, growing more and more insistent. She saw it in the corners of her house, in the flicker of candlelight, in the shadow cast by the trees outside her window. It was as if Neca had become a part of her every waking moment, and in every dark corner she was reminded of her crime. The guilt became unbearable, and soon she could no longer deny it. Neca's spirit was seeking vengeance, and there was nowhere she could run. Desperate, Ngozi sought guidance from the village elder, a wise woman who had lived through countless seasons and had seen the cycles of life and death unfold before her. The elder was known for her knowledge of spirits and the ancient ways, and Ngozi hoped that the elder could offer some relief from the torment that plagued her. Ngozi found the elder sitting outside her hut one evening, her hands gently moving through the herbs that she always kept by her side. The old woman looked up as Ngozi approached, her eyes sharp and knowing. There was no need for words. The elder could see the fear in Ngozi's eyes, the weight of guilt that hung over her like a storm cloud. "It is the shadow of Neca that haunts you," the elder said quietly, her voice thick with the wisdom of years. "Her spirit has not been allowed to rest." Ngozi sank to her knees, her hands trembling. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't want to." The elder raised a hand, silencing her. "The wrongs you have done cannot be undone by words alone, Ngozi. You have brought a great injustice into this village. Neca's death was not natural. It was the result of a betrayal, a foulness that now lingers in the air. Her spirit cannot rest until she is avenged." Tears welled up in Ngozi's eyes as the weight of the elder's words sank in. She had known, deep down, that her actions had consequences. But hearing the elder speak the truth so plainly made it impossible to deny the reality of what she had done. "The shadow that haunts you is not just Neca's spirit," the elder continued, her voice grave. "It is the collective guilt of all who played a part in her death. It is a warning to you, to the village. The spirits of the dead will not be silenced until justice is served. Ngozi felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted, as though the earth itself had opened up and swallowed her whole. "What must I do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The elder's eyes softened, but there was no kindness in her gaze. "There is only one way to stop the shadow. You must make amends for what you have done. You must confess your betrayal to the village and accept the consequences of your actions. Only then will Neca's spirit find peace." The words hung heavy in the air, a burden that threatened to crush Ngozi's spirit. But she knew that the elder was right. The shadow would never stop until she faced the truth and took responsibility for the crime she had committed. With a heavy heart, Ngozi rose to her feet, feeling as if the weight of the world had been placed upon her shoulders. She had lived with the lie for so long, but now she could no longer hide from it. The shadow would not rest until the truth was revealed. And as much as it terrified her, she knew that it was the only way to find peace, for herself and for Neca. The elder's warning echoed in her ears: the shadow will not stop until Neca's death is avenged, and her spirit is properly laid to rest. The weight of those words settled in her chest, a constant reminder that the path to redemption would not be an easy one. But it was the only path left to her now. As Ngozi left the elder's hut, the sky above seemed darker, more foreboding, as though the very earth was holding its breath. The shadow had already begun to return, and the village of Nkambi would never be the same. As the days passed, the shadow of Neca grew stronger. What had once been a mere flicker in the moonlight had now become a powerful, almost tangible force. It moved with purpose, haunting not just Ngozi, but anyone who had been involved in the plot that had led to Neca's untimely death. The shadow's presence was no longer fleeting, it was persistent, following its victims, tormenting them in their dreams, and making them feel the weight of their guilt at every turn. It was the guilty parties who felt its effects the most. Illness began to sweep through the households of those who had played a role in Neca's poisoning. First, it was a fever, followed by a debilitating sickness that left people weak and frail. The illness spread rapidly through the village, and no one could explain why it was so selective. Some villagers whispered that it was the curse of the shadow, a punishment for the wrongs that had been committed. The feeling of dread hung thick in the air, and even those who were innocent could not escape the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to settle over Nkambi. The nightmares were even worse. Those who had been involved in Neca's death would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with their hearts pounding in their chests. They dreamt of Neca, her face twisted in anger, her eyes burning with an intensity that pierced their very souls. In the dreams, she would stand at the edge of their beds, her shadow looming over them, her spirit calling for retribution. The terror would grip them so fiercely that many woke up unable to move, unable to breathe. They were trapped in a nightmare that seemed endless, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't escape it. Ngozi in particular felt the full weight of the shadow's power. The guilt gnawed at her relentlessly, and it wasn't just her waking moments that were consumed by fear, it was every moment of every day. She could feel the shadow watching her, always present, lurking just behind her. Her dreams were filled with images of Neca's shadow, a dark and silent presence that moved through her house, crept through the cracks in the walls and hovered over her, its cold fingers brushing against her skin. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Ngozi decided to confront the shadow. She could not continue living in such fear, in such torment. With her heart pounding in her chest, she ventured out into the night, determined to face whatever lay ahead. She knew that if she didn't confront the shadow now, it would only grow stronger, and she would never be free of its grip. As she walked through the village, the air felt thick with tension. The usual nighttime sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, were eerily absent. Only the faint whisper of the wind stirred the silence, and it seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Ngozi's footsteps echoed on the dirt path, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel it. The shadow was waiting for her, lurking just out of sight, its presence pressing down on her like a heavy weight. When she reached the clearing where Neca had been buried, she stopped. The ground was still fresh, the earth undisturbed, but the air around her seemed to shift, as if something was stirring beneath the surface. And then there it was. A flicker of movement in the corner of her vision. She turned, her body tense, her heart racing. The shadow was there, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was not a mere silhouette, but a dark, swirling mass that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. It was no longer just an absence of light. It had taken on a life of its own, moving as though it were an entity, a force that existed beyond the boundaries of the physical world. It shifted and stretched, wrapping around the trees, crawling across the ground, and then it reached for her. Ngozi's body trembled as the shadow inched closer. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs were rooted to the spot, her body paralyzed by fear. She opened her mouth but no words came out. It was as if the air itself had thickened, choking off any sound. The shadow loomed larger, its edges sharp and jagged, like the teeth of some great beast waiting to devour her. And then, as if it had heard her thoughts, the shadow surged forward, enveloping her in darkness. Her breath hitched and she stumbled backward, her hands outstretched as if to ward off the shadow. But it was no use. The darkness surrounded her, pressing against her skin, crawling up her arms, and filling her chest with a suffocating weight. The shadow seemed to grow colder, more insistent, as if it were feeding on her fear. It was then that Ngozi heard a voice, a soft whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You betrayed me," the voice said, the words laced with pain and fury. It was Neca's voice, but it was not the gentle tone she had once known. It was cold, harsh, filled with a deep sorrow and rage. Ngozi's knees buckled and she collapsed to the ground. "Neca, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant for this to happen. I was afraid. I didn't know what to do." The shadow pulsed with energy and the voice grew louder, sharper. "You took my life. You stole my future. Now you will pay for your treachery." Ngozi's heart pounded in her chest as the shadow pressed in, the weight of her guilt nearly suffocating her. The darkness seemed to draw closer, tightening around her like a noose. She could feel Neca's spirit, full of anger and vengeance, surrounding her, suffocating her. And then, as if the shadow had heard her cries, it receded slightly, the pressure easing just enough for Ngozi to breathe. But the voice of Neca didn't stop. "You are not the only one who must answer for my death," the voice said, and Ngozi could feel the spirit's anger turn toward the others who had conspired against her. The shadow stretched out across the village, moving from house to house, from one conspirator to the next. It was no longer just a haunting presence. It had become an instrument of vengeance, an embodiment of the wrongs that had been done. Each conspirator felt the shadow's cold touch, each one suffering in their own way. Illness plagued the guilty, nightmares tore through their minds, and the weight of their actions became unbearable. The shadow was relentless. It did not stop until the final conspirator had been made to face the consequences of their actions. As the last of the guilty felt the cold hand of the shadow, Neca's voice called out once more. "The time for revenge has passed," the voice whispered, fading into the night. "Now let my spirit rest." And with that, the shadow withdrew, leaving the village in stunned silence. The curse had been fulfilled, the balance restored. Neca's spirit had avenged her death, and the village would never forget the price of betrayal. The village of Nkambi was never the same again after the shadow of Neca began its relentless pursuit of vengeance. In the days that followed, those who had been complicit in Neca's death were struck by a series of misfortunes that seemed almost too cruel to be mere coincidence. It started with a sickness, a strange fever that no healer could treat, which spread rapidly through the families of the conspirators. The fever would come and go, but each time it returned, it left the victims weaker, more fragile. Their bodies were riddled with pain, and their minds grew clouded with confusion. As the illness ravaged them, other misfortunes followed. The crops they had planted began to wither, animals in their pens grew sick and died, and the wells from which they drew water began to run dry. It was as though the earth itself was punishing them for the wrongs they had committed. The villagers whispered that the shadow was at work, exacting its toll, and that it would not stop until all who had played a part in Neca's death had paid. Among the conspirators, fear began to set in. No one could escape the shadow's reach, and those who had been involved in the plot to poison Neca found themselves trapped in a never-ending cycle of suffering. They could not escape their guilt, and no matter how hard they tried to outrun the shadow, it always followed them. In the dead of night, they would hear whispers or catch glimpses of a dark figure just outside their homes. The fear gnawed at their sanity, and some began to lose their grip on reality. But it was Ngozi, the woman who had betrayed Neca the most, who felt the shadow's power most keenly. Her guilt was the heaviest, for she had been the one to mix the poison, the one who had deceived Neca into trusting her. Her mind had begun to unravel as the shadow's presence became more pronounced. It was as if the very air around her had thickened with the weight of her wrongdoing. The others had suffered in their own ways, but it was Ngozi who had truly been consumed by the shadow's wrath. Desperate to end her torment, Ngozi sought the help of the village elder once more. She had no peace, no rest, and every night, she feared she would never wake from the dreams that plagued her. She begged the elder to help her find a way to stop the shadow, to somehow make it go away, but the elder's words were not what she wanted to hear. "Neca's spirit will not rest until justice has been served," the elder said, her voice grave. "You cannot outrun the consequences of your actions. What you have done cannot be undone. Ngozi's eyes filled with tears as she fell to her knees. Please, she begged. I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt her. But now I can't escape it. The shadow follows me everywhere. It's like it's waiting for me to. The elder shook her head, her face sorrowful. There is no escape, Ngozi. You must face the judgment of the spirits, and only then will the shadow release you. But know this, there will be no mercy. And so it was that one night, as the moon rose high in the sky, Ngozi was dragged into the forest by the shadow. She had no control over her body, as if some unseen force was pulling her toward her fate. Her heart raced as she struggled against the weight of the darkness that consumed her, but it was useless. The shadow was stronger than she could ever imagine. The forest seemed alive with the presence of spirits as Ngozi was taken deeper and deeper into its heart. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches reaching toward her as if to pull her into the earth itself. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor, moving like tendrils reaching for her. She could hear whispers, soft at first but growing louder, until they drowned out all other sound. The voices of the dead, the voices of those who had been wronged, whispered to her, their words filled with judgment and anger. Neca, Ngozi cried out, her voice trembling. I am sorry. Please forgive me. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't mean for this to happen. But the shadow did not answer. It was silent, moving with purpose, dragging her toward the place where Neca had been buried. And there, in the clearing, Ngozi saw the figure of Neca standing before her. But this was no longer the sweet, kind woman she had once known. Neca's eyes were filled with fire, her face twisted in anger, and her form radiated a cold, unyielding fury. Neca, Ngozi whispered, falling to her knees before the spirit. Please, I beg of you, forgive me. I never wanted to hurt you. But Neca's spirit was not interested in forgiveness. Instead, she forced Ngozi to witness her own death, trapping her in the vision of the moment she had poisoned Neca. The world around her shifted, and Ngozi was transported back in time, back to the moment when she had slipped the poison into Neca's drink. She saw it all again, the way Neca had smiled at her, the trust in her eyes as she took the drink, the way her body had gone limp as the poison took effect. And then she saw Neca's face in the moments before her death, the shock, the pain, and finally the stillness that came when the life left her body. Ngozi screamed, but the vision did not stop. It replayed over and over again, each time more vivid, more real. She could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her, suffocating her, until she could no longer breathe. Her body shook, and her mind shattered as she was forced to relive her betrayal in the most intimate and horrific way possible. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the vision stopped. Ngozi was left kneeling in the clearing, her body racked with sobs. The shadow receded, leaving her broken and alone, her spirit shattered by the consequences of her actions. But the punishment did not end there. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, the shadow lifted, and Ngozi was left in the silence of the forest. She was no longer the woman she had once been. Her eyes were hollow, her soul destroyed by the guilt and the fear of what she had done. She had been judged and she had been found wanting. Neca's spirit, having exacted its revenge, finally began to fade. The shadow that had haunted the village for so long receded into the earth, and the curse was broken. The village of Nkambi returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the memory of the shadow and the reckoning it had brought would never be forgotten. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of the events that had unfolded, of the lesson that had been learned. The price of betrayal was steep, and every wrong would eventually be paid for, whether in life or death. The village had been changed forever. The once thriving community was now subdued, haunted by the knowledge that the past could never be outrun. The shadows of their actions would always be there, waiting to catch up with them, no matter how hard they tried to hide. And so, as the years passed, the story of Neca and the shadow became a legend, passed down from generation to generation. It was a warning, a reminder that no one could escape the consequences of their actions. In the end, the shadow would always return to claim its due, and the reckoning would come. As the village settled into its new reality, a final question lingered in the air, one that would never be answered fully but would always be asked in quiet corners and late-night conversations. What would you do if your own shadow came to knock on your door? Would you seek redemption, or would you face the consequences of your actions? And every betrayal eventually demands its reckoning. Over time, Neca's tale takes on a life of its own, morphing into a story woven into the fabric of the village's culture. Elders recount it to the youth, and parents tell it to their children before bed. The villagers, though they no longer experience the supernatural torment that once gripped them, carry with them the wisdom Neca's shadow left behind. The legend becomes more than just a warning about vengeance. It transforms into a story about the deep responsibility every individual has toward their community and the importance of personal integrity. Betrayal, as the villagers have learned, doesn't just harm the victim, it ripples outward, affecting everyone involved, and sometimes even those who are only tangentially connected to the crime. The shadow, which once haunted their every waking hour, now serves as a metaphor for the actions that follow us, no matter how deeply buried they may be. In the years following Neca's vengeance, the village shifts. People become more cautious, more thoughtful. They speak with care, choosing their words wisely, knowing that a single misstep could lead to consequences that echo beyond what they can imagine. The community's trust in one another grows stronger as they collectively agree to uphold the memory of Neca, not only as a victim of betrayal but also as a symbol of justice and moral fortitude. As the village heals, the changes are evident in every corner of Nkambi. The once divided community has become unified, bound together by the shared lessons of Neca's tragic tale. The elders speak of Neca's spirit in reverent tones, urging the younger generation to embody the values she represented: love, loyalty, and most importantly, justice. And yet, even as the village thrives, the shadow lingers, albeit in a different form. The legacy of Neca's story exists not only in the villagers' collective memory but also in the very way they live their lives. The moral compass that was so thoroughly tested by Neca's death and vengeance now guides the decisions of the community. The villagers speak of living without shadows, which means living with integrity, ensuring that no one's actions are cloaked in deceit, and that every wrong is addressed before it becomes a shadow that will one day demand its reckoning. The villagers, while moving on with their lives, now hold a deep respect for the spirits that surround them, aware that they are not to be ignored or mistreated. Neca's story, her betrayal, and her vengeance have taught them that the past is not to be forgotten. It's not to be silenced by time or buried beneath layers of forgetfulness. The dead have a voice, and that voice will be heard no matter how long it takes. Among the youth, the story of Neca has taken on a more symbolic meaning. It serves as a guide for them as they move into adulthood. Some see it as a lesson in the power of forgiveness and redemption, believing that if someone like Ngozi could face the consequences of her actions and be forced to confront the spirit of the person she betrayed, then perhaps forgiveness and redemption can also come from taking responsibility for one's own wrongdoings. Other members of the community, however, view the tale as a cautionary one, an admonition against ever straying from the path of righteousness. For them, Neca's shadow is a reminder that while time may heal many wounds, it does not erase the consequences of one's actions. The story of Ngozi's tragic end serves as proof of this. Her downfall was not merely the result of the torment of the shadow, but also a culmination of her own guilt and self-loathing. It is the recognition that there is no escaping responsibility, that there are no shortcuts to redemption. Neca's shadow also reminds the villagers of the fine balance between the living and the dead, a lesson that has become ingrained in their collective consciousness. The villagers, once fearful of the spirits, now show reverence for them, offering prayers and tributes to ensure that the spirits remain at peace. It is said that the presence of the shadow was a sign that Neca's spirit could not rest until she had received justice. But now that justice has been served, the villagers are more mindful of how they honor their ancestors, for they understand that to dishonor the dead is to invite the wrath of the spirits into their lives. As for Ngozi, her fate is sealed in the whispers of the village. No one speaks of her with any warmth, and her name has become synonymous with betrayal. Some say that her punishment was not just the physical torment she endured but the weight of her own guilt, which ultimately shattered her spirit. She is remembered as a cautionary figure, a symbol of what happens when a person betrays the trust of those who love them. Years pass and life in Nkambi begins to return to a semblance of normalcy. The village continues to thrive, and the shadow of Neca's vengeance becomes a distant memory. But the story of her death, the curse of her shadow, and the justice that followed remains. The villagers continue to pass the tale down to future generations, ensuring that the lessons learned from Neca's death are never forgotten. The story of Neca and the shadow will live on as long as there are those who listen, and it will continue to shape the village's culture and values. For generations to come, children will grow up hearing the tale, understanding the importance of loyalty, respect, and the consequences of betraying the ones they love. And as the village of Nkambi flourishes, the legacy of Neca's shadow endures as a beacon of justice and moral clarity. Her story serves as a reminder that no evil deed goes unnoticed, and that every betrayal will eventually be brought to light, whether in life or death. The villagers of Nkambi know that they must live their lives with honesty and integrity, for the shadow of Neca will always be watching. Years passed. Seasons turned over like the leaves of an old book, each one whispering the same tale that had gripped the hearts of Nkambi. The village, though rebuilt and restored in its external calm, never truly rid itself of the shadow that once swept through its heart like a silent storm. The people, old and young, still spoke her name in hushed reverence, Neca. Not just for the beauty she had once carried in her eyes or the kindness in her voice, but for the shadow that had returned when her soul was wronged. The story never faded. It became something more powerful than mere memory. It became legacy. Neca's tale was no longer spoken only around fires at night. It wove itself into lullabies mothers sang to their children. It was inscribed into the rhythm of drumbeats during rituals. Her name became a symbol, not of vengeance alone but of awakening. Because in seeking justice, Neca had not merely punished the guilty, she had reshaped the village's soul. There was a new respect for silence in Nkambi. Not the silence of fear, but the kind born from knowing that some things echo louder when unsaid. The kind of silence that fell over the village at dusk, just before the first stars blinked into the sky, when even the wind held its breath, as though waiting to see if a shadow would pass by once more. Children were taught from a young age the weight of truth and the burden of lies. Elders no longer dismissed the murmurs of the spirit world. Shrines once forgotten were cleaned and honored again. Offerings were made, not out of fear but respect. The drums beat more slowly now during ceremonies, their pace set not by festivity but reverence. And in the center of the village, where Neca's hut once stood, a garden now bloomed. Not wild, but carefully tended by the hands of those who remembered her. Flowers in her favorite colors were planted, deep red hibiscus and soft yellow alamanda. It was said that on some nights, her shadow still danced between the petals when the moon was just right. And if you stood still enough, you could hear a faint whisper carried on the breeze. Truth will always return. Justice wears many faces. Ngozi, whose betrayal sparked the storm, had vanished from the village after that final reckoning. Some claimed she wandered into the forest, never to return. Others swore they saw her shadow crying beneath the great baobab tree at the edge of the earth, cursed to live between realms, forever chased by the image of what she had done. Her name, once spoken with warmth, became a warning. Parents now told their daughters, "Do not let envy blind you like it did Ngozi." And sons were taught that betrayal was not only a crime of blood, it was a crime against the soul. But the legacy of Neca was not sorrow alone. Her spirit, once vengeful, had found peace. And with that peace came healing, not just for herself but for the village. Those who once looked away from injustice learned to speak. Those who once remained silent when harm was done now stood up, even if their voices trembled. The people of Nkambi had seen what happens when the dead are not allowed to rest, and more importantly what happens when the living forget their duty to the truth. The village elder, now gray and bent with age, often sat beneath the tree where Neca's shadow had first appeared after her burial. He would tell wide-eyed children her story, not with fear in his voice but quiet strength. She came back not only to haunt us, he would say, but to remind us that our shadows walk with us. And if we betray what is good, what is right, those shadows will turn against us. And then he would ask the question that had become a tradition, passed from lips to ears, from one generation to the next. If your own shadow came to knock at your door, would you open it? Many villagers swore that on the anniversary of her death, the winds changed. The air became heavier. Animals grew restless. That was when they left candles at her garden. Not to keep her spirit away but to honor it. To thank her for the truth her return had uncovered. Years later, when travelers came through Nkambi, they always heard the same tale from innkeepers and market women alike. They buried her body at midnight, they would say, but before sunrise her shadow knocked at their door. It was no longer a story of mere horror, it was a lesson, a living legend. And in its wake the village became known not just for its beauty, but for its wisdom. For its understanding that the past never truly sleeps, and that when the dead rise they do so to teach the living how to live better. The garden became a sacred place. Not a shrine in the traditional sense, but a place where those seeking forgiveness or clarity would go and sit. Some spoke to the air, hoping to find the courage Neca had once carried. Others simply sat in silence, letting the stories of the past guide their thoughts. It was said that one child, born on the very night Neca's shadow had last been seen, could see things others could not. She often stood quietly in the garden, speaking to someone no one else could see. When asked who she spoke with, she would smile softly and say, "I'm listening to the shadow. She's telling me not to be afraid." Neca's story taught that vengeance may be born from pain, but justice rises from truth. That silence, when it hides evil, becomes a curse, but when it honors memory, becomes sacred. And that shadows, though feared, are nothing but reflections of the light we turn away from. As for the villagers, they never forgot the midnight burial, the sunrise knocking, or the shadow that refused to be silenced. And they never would. Because now they understood. They understood that every action has a cost. That spirits remember what men forget. That truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to rise. And that sometimes, the most powerful voice is not the one that speaks, but the one that returns from the grave to remind us that the past does not die. It waits. So ask yourself, as the villagers did every year on the day the winds howled differently, if your past knocked on your door in the form of your own shadow, would you run? Would you beg? Or would you open the door and face what you have buried?